Gareth Mitchell couldn't shake the image of the strange boy crying by his wife's grave. Who was that child? And why had his loyal dog, Kaiser, been so strangely restless since that fateful encounter? But his questions were soon overshadowed by sheer astonishment. In his late wife's study, Kaiser paced relentlessly before nudging the spine of an old book on the shelf with his nose. The dog seemed to be trying to tell him something, pointing to a secret Rebecca had hidden away. Curious, Gareth took the book down, and what he found inside was not just a mysterious key, but also a faded, yellowed ultrasound photo. An unbelievable truth was about to be exposed, a truth that would change his life forever. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The rain began just after dawn, a soft, persistent whisper against the window panes of the small house nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. For Gareth Mitchell, the sound was a familiar companion, a gray curtain that separated his quiet world from the one that continued to turn without him. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the world had fractured, since the two events that defined his life had occurred in devastating succession. The phone call from a stoic officer about an accident on a winding mountain road, and the subsequent arrival of his honorable discharge papers. He had left the Marine Corps not as a hero returning from the sands of Afghanistan, but as a man hollowed out by a grief so profound it had its own gravitational pull. Gareth, now in his late 30s, wore the past on his face. It was a handsome face, but weathered, etched with lines of sorrow and fatigue that ran deeper than his years. His short brown hair was shot with silver at the temples, a stark white against the tan skin. A thick stubble shadowed his jaw, hiding the gentler lines of his mouth. He was tall and lean, the hard muscle of a soldier softened by time but not erased, moving with a quiet economy that spoke of years of discipline. His uniform now consisted of a faded navy and gray plaid shirt, left unbuttoned over a plain gray t-shirt, worn blue jeans, and a pair of sturdy work boots that had seen better days. This was his life now, the quiet rustle of leaves, the scent of damp earth, and the unyielding silence of a house once filled with laughter. At his feet, a magnificent German shepherd stirred, lifting a noble head from his paws. Kaiser was a 7-year-old sable, his thick coat a tapestry of gray, silver, and black. His intelligent amber eyes were fixed on Gareth. Kaiser was more than a dog. He was an anchor, a living, breathing connection to a time when joy was simple and the future was a promise, not a threat. He had been Rebecca's dog first, a fluffy, clumsy puppy they had picked out together. Now he was Gareth's shadow, a silent warden against the ghosts of memory that haunted the corners of the house. Kaiser seemed to understand the topography of Gareth's grief, knowing when to press his heavy head into his lap for comfort and when to simply lie nearby, a warm and steady presence in the overwhelming quiet. Today, the quiet was heavier than usual. October 10th. The date was seared into his mind. The rain seemed to know it too, its rhythm a mournful drumbeat against the roof. Kaiser whined softly, a low rumble in his chest. He nudged Gareth's hand with his cold, wet nose. "I know, boy," Gareth murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "I know." He didn't need a calendar. His body knew. His soul knew. It was the day he had to face the granite headstone that bore her name, Rebecca Mitchell, beloved wife. 1990-2020. The words were an insult, a ridiculously small summary for a life that had been so vibrant, so full of music and light. An hour later, they were in his old pickup truck, the windshield wipers struggling to keep time with the downpour. The drive to Whispering Pines Cemetery was short, a journey through winding roads shrouded in mist, the brilliant autumn foliage of the mountains muted to somber tones of rust and gold. Gareth parked near the wrought iron gates and pulled the hood of his rain jacket over his head. Kaiser, ever patient, waited for the command before hopping down from the passenger seat, his paws landing silently on the wet grass. The cemetery was deserted. a lonely landscape of stone and weeping willows. The air was thick with the smell of rain and decaying leaves. Their path was a familiar one, worn into the grass by 5 years of solitary pilgrimages. They stopped before the simple granite marker. Gareth stood motionless, the rain dripping from his hood, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had no words. He never did. He just stood there, letting the cold seep into his bones, a physical manifestation of the cold that had taken up permanent residence in his heart. Kaiser, however, was not still. He usually sat stoically by Gareth's side during these visits, a silent honor guard. But today, he was restless. He paced a small circle, his ears twitching, his nose to the ground. A low whine escaped his throat, and the fur along his spine bristled. He took a few steps away from the grave, then looked back at Gareth, his intelligent eyes wide with an emotion Gareth couldn't decipher. "What is it, boy?" Gareth asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kaiser didn't respond to the command. Instead, he pulled taut on the leash, his powerful body straining in a direction away from the path toward a large oak tree 50 yards away. Gareth's first instinct was to correct him, to pull him back, but there was an urgency in the dog's posture, an insistence that was unusual. Trusting the animal's instincts over his own apathy, Gareth relented, letting Kaiser lead him through the wet grass, between the silent rows of headstones. As they drew closer, Gareth saw it. A small figure, hunched over, almost lost in the gray deluge. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, a scrawny child in a thin jacket, his dark hair plastered to his head by the rain. And he was standing directly in front of Rebecca's grave. He wasn't just standing there, his small shoulders were shaking with silent, heartbreaking sobs. A knot of confusion and concern tightened in Gareth's chest. What was a child doing out here alone in this weather? And why, of all the graves in this cemetery, was he at Rebecca's? Gareth's protective instincts, long dormant, flickered to life. He shortened the leash, taking a cautious step forward, intending to ask the boy if he was all right, if he was lost. Before he could speak, another figure emerged from the mist, moving with a silent, gliding grace that was unnerving. It was a man, tall and impeccably dressed in a dark tailored overcoat that seemed to repel the rain. He held a large black umbrella which he positioned over the boy's head. "There you are, Mike," the man said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "I told you not to wander off." The man looked up, and his eyes met Gareth's. They were pale, intelligent eyes, but they held a chilling lack of warmth. He offered a practiced, charming smile that didn't quite reach them. "I do apologize," he said, his tone polite and controlled. "He's a sensitive boy. We shouldn't be out in this weather, I know." He introduced himself as Alistair Finch, the director of a charitable foundation called the Evergreen Circle. He explained that Mike was under his care. Gareth just stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. Kaiser stood rigid at his side, a low, almost inaudible growl vibrating in his chest. Finch's smile tightened for a fraction of a second as he glanced at the dog, then back at Gareth. "He's been asking about his mother recently," Finch continued, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy. He gestured vaguely toward Rebecca's headstone. "The woman who raised him passed away. He has questions, you see. Children do. I felt it was important for his emotional well-being to have a place to remember, even on a day like this." The explanation was smooth, logical, and utterly disquieting. Every word felt rehearsed, every gesture calculated. Finch was performing, using the storm and the lonely cemetery as his stage. Gareth looked from Finch's polished face to the small, grieving boy, and then to the name carved on the stone. A cold, dreadful feeling began to unspool in the pit of his stomach. This was no coincidence. Finch's presence here, on this day, felt like a violation, a calculated intrusion into his sacred grief. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a victor surveying his prize. "Come now, Mike," Finch said softly, turning the boy away from the grave. "Let's get you out of the rain." As they walked away, the boy, Mike, cast one last fleeting glance over his shoulder. For a single, heart-stopping moment, his wide, tear-filled eyes met Gareth's. And in their depths, Gareth saw a flicker of something he recognized, a shadow of a face he saw every time he looked in the mirror. Finch and the boy disappeared back into the mist, leaving Gareth standing alone in the downpour, the leash slack in his hand. The numbness that had been his shield for 5 years was gone, shattered. In its place was a storm of confusion, suspicion, and an emotion so foreign he could barely name it, a terrifying, impossible flicker of hope. Kaiser pressed against his leg, a solid, grounding force, as if to say, "Did you see it too?" The drive back from Whispering Pines was a blur of rain-streaked asphalt and muted autumn colors. Gareth drove on autopilot, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind a maelstrom of disjointed images. A small, trembling back, tear-filled eyes that mirrored his own, the cold, polished smile of Alistair Finch. The silence in the truck's cab was different now. It was no longer the heavy, comforting quiet of solitude. It was a humming, electric silence, charged with questions that had no answers. Beside him, Kaiser sat alert, his usual calm replaced by a watchful tension. He would occasionally turn his head, his amber eyes meeting Gareth's in the rearview mirror, as if to confirm they had both witnessed the same tear in the fabric of reality. Back in the house, the familiar routine fell apart. Normally, Gareth would have toweled the rain from Kaiser's thick coat, started a fire in the hearth, and settled into the worn armchair with a book he wouldn't actually read. But today, he couldn't be still. He shed his wet jacket, leaving it in a heap by the door, and began to pace the length of the living room, from the cold fireplace to the window that looked out onto the dripping forest. The numbness that had been his companion for 5 years had been a mercy. It had dulled the sharp edges of his grief, allowing him to function, to breathe, to simply exist from one sunrise to the next. Now that numbness was gone, ripped away, leaving every nerve exposed. In its place was a raw, agitating energy. Hope, he had thought at the cemetery. But was it hope? Or was it a more dangerous kind of madness? He stopped his pacing and sank onto the edge of the sofa, burying his face in his hands. It was impossible. He knew it was. He and Rebecca had tried for years. They had seen doctors, specialists who had spoken in gentle, clinical tones about scar tissue from an old injury, about probabilities that were statistically insignificant. He had been the reason. The fault was his. Rebecca had accepted it with a grace that had both humbled and broken him. She had poured all her love into him, into Kaiser, into the life they were building in these mountains. She had never once made him feel like he was less than whole. So who was that boy? And why had Finch, a man of apparent wealth and influence, chosen that exact day, that exact place, for his act of calculated charity? The man's explanation was a lie. Gareth knew it with the same certainty he knew the feel of a rifle in his hands. It was too neat, too polished. It was a story designed to deflect, to placate, to end questioning before it could even begin. Driven by a need to do something, anything, Gareth went to his old laptop, the machine slow to wake from its long slumber. The internet connection was sluggish, a thin thread to the outside world. He typed Alistair Finch into the search bar. The results flooded the screen, painting a portrait of a modern-day saint. There were articles in glossy magazines, society pages filled with photos of Finch at charity galas, shaking hands with senators, his arm around smiling celebrities. He was the founder and benefactor of the Evergreen Circle, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing elite care and opportunities for orphaned and underprivileged children. The foundation's website was a masterpiece of corporate philanthropy, featuring heartwarming video testimonials from adoptive parents, tearful success stories of children who had gone on to attend prestigious universities, all thanks to the generosity and vision of Alistair Finch. Gareth clicked through link after link, a cold dread growing in his stomach. Everything was perfect. There wasn't a single negative comment, not a hint of scandal, not one dissenting voice in the chorus of praise. It was an impenetrable digital fortress, a life story curated with meticulous precision. He was a ghost, a phantom of philanthropy, too good to be true. Frustrated, Gareth pushed back from the desk. The online search was a dead end. Finch was a professional, shielded by a wall of money and public goodwill. While Gareth had been staring at the screen, Kaiser had grown more and more agitated. The dog had been whining softly, pacing between Gareth's desk and the doorway of the adjacent room. It was Rebecca's study. Gareth hadn't changed a thing in there. It was preserved just as she had left it, a museum of a life cut short. Her favorite armchair sat in the corner. A bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks stood against one wall, and the faint scent of her favorite lavender and vanilla candle still clung to the air. It was the one room Gareth avoided. The pain it held was too acute. But Kaiser was insistent. He stood in the doorway, looking back at Gareth, his tail low, his ears flattened. He let out a soft woof, not a bark, but a sound of urgent communication. Gareth rose and followed him into the room. Kaiser walked directly to the large, built-in bookshelf that took up most of the far wall. He ignored the lower shelves, instead standing on his hind legs, placing his front paws gently against the wood and pushing his nose toward a specific book on a higher shelf. He nudged it once, twice, then looked back at Gareth, his eyes pleading. "What is it, boy?" Gareth whispered, his heart beginning to pound. It was a collection of classic poetry, bound in dark green leather. He remembered the day they had bought it at a small, dusty bookstore in Asheville. He reached up and pulled the book from the shelf. It felt slightly heavier than he remembered, a subtle, almost imperceptible imbalance. He carried it back into the living room and sat down, placing it carefully on the coffee table. Kaiser rested his head on Gareth's knee, his gaze fixed on the book. With trembling hands, Gareth opened the cover. The pages fell open to the middle, to a poem she had often read aloud to him, and there, pressed between the verses, was a small rectangular hollow that had been carefully cut into the pages. Nestled inside was a faded, folded piece of paper and a small, cold object. Gareth's breath hitched. He gently lifted the paper out. It was a sonogram photo, the black and white image grainy and indistinct to his untrained eye. But the text printed at the top was clear. It was Rebecca's name and a date from just over 5 years ago, only a few months before the accident. His mind refused to accept what he was seeing. It had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Then he picked up the other object. It was a small brass key, the kind used for a safe deposit box. An account number was etched onto its head on a small metal tag. He stared at the two items lying in his palm, an image of a life he never knew existed, and a key to a secret he never knew was kept. The foundation of his grief, built on the solid bedrock of a medical diagnosis, cracked. Through that crack, a sliver of impossible, terrifying light shone through. He looked from the photo to Kaiser, whose amber eyes were filled with an ancient, knowing sadness. The dog wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian, a silent keeper of a promise, a living embodiment of Rebecca's desperate, enduring love. And he had just delivered the first part of her message. Time seemed to warp and bend in the quiet living room. Gareth sat frozen, the sonogram photo and the small brass key lying in his palm like artifacts from an alternate reality. The steady drumming of the rain outside was the only sound, a metronome counting the seconds of a life he had failed to notice. His mind, trained for the rigid logic of combat, struggled to reconcile two opposing truths: the clinical finality of a doctor's diagnosis 5 years ago and the undeniable evidence now resting in his hand. He had built his entire world, his entire grief, upon the foundation that he was broken, that he was the reason their future had a missing piece. Rebecca had been his rock, absorbing his silent sorrow and loving him so completely that he almost forgot the void. But this photo, this key, suggested a different story, a story in which he was not the cause of the emptiness, but a victim of a truth he never knew. A story in which Rebecca had carried a secret of immense joy and terrifying burden, all alone. A wave of guilt, so powerful it was physically nauseating, washed over him. While he had been lost in his own pain, she had been navigating something extraordinary. Had he been so wrapped up in his own loss that he had missed the signs? Had he failed her that profoundly? Kaiser, sensing the new and turbulent storm in Gareth's emotions, rested his heavy head firmly on his thigh, a solid grounding weight. Gareth absently stroked the dog's thick fur, the repetitive motion a small anchor in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. The sonogram and the key were a beginning, a shocking prologue. But they weren't the whole story. He needed context. He needed to understand. He needed to hear her voice again, even if only from the pages of the past. His gaze swept across the living room, searching for something, though he didn't know what. His eyes landed on the mantelpiece, on a collection of framed photos. And there, tucked behind a picture of their wedding day, was a small, ornate wooden box. It was a music box, carved from dark cherry wood, with 2 intertwined oak leaves on the lid. He had given it to her on their first anniversary. It played a simple, haunting melody from an old folk song, a tune they had both loved, a tune they had called their own. He hadn't touched it in 5 years. He rose slowly, his movements stiff, and walked to the fireplace. He picked up the music box, the wood cool and smooth beneath his fingers. He ran his thumb over the carved leaves. For a moment, he was transported back to that day, to the look of pure delight on Rebecca's face when he gave it to her. He had been whole then. They had been whole. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid. The delicate, tinkling notes of the melody filled the silent room. It was a sound both beautiful and agonizing, a ghost of a happier time. But as the music played, he noticed something else. The velvet lining on the bottom of the box was slightly raised in one corner. His heart hammered against his ribs. He carefully worked his fingernail under the edge and lifted it. Tucked beneath was a small, leather-bound journal, no bigger than his hand. He closed the music box, silencing the melody, and carried the journal back to the sofa. It was a simple diary, its brown leather cover soft and worn. He opened it, his hands unsteady. The first page was dated in March of 2020. Her handwriting was a familiar, elegant script, a series of graceful loops and curves that was as much a part of her as her smile. "It's true," the first entry began. 2 lines. "The doctor confirmed it this morning. I'm carrying a life. Our life. I wanted to tell Gareth the second I walked in the door, to see his face, to feel his arms lift me off the ground. But then I remembered. The finality in that specialist's voice. The quiet way Gareth looked at his hands after we left that office, as if they had failed him. This news, this miracle, could be the cruelest kind of hope if something goes wrong. So I will hold this secret, this tiny, perfect flame, just for a little while. I will protect him from the possibility of more pain. When I am sure, when it is safe, I will give him back the future he thinks he lost." Gareth had to stop, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. He could feel her love, her fierce protective instinct, not just for the child, but for him. She had been shielding him. He read on, page after page, swept up in her secret joy. She wrote about morning sickness, about strange cravings for pickles and ice cream, about picking out names. She wrote about how Kaiser seemed to know, often resting his head gently on her still flat stomach. Then the tone of the entries began to shift. A new name appeared. Alistair Finch. "Met the most charming man today," she had written in late April. Alistair Finch. He's the head of that Evergreen Foundation. He wants to sponsor the community art program I've been trying to get off the ground. He seems so genuine, so passionate about helping the children in our small town. In the beginning, Finch was a welcome presence. He was generous, attentive, and full of praise for her work. But as the weeks went on, a subtle darkness began to creep into the edges of her words. Alistair stopped by the house again today. Gareth was out. He brought flowers. It was a kind gesture, but something felt off. He stayed a little too long. He has a way of looking at you, a kind of intensity, as if he's trying to see right through you. A few weeks later, the entry was more unnerving. I told Alistair I couldn't make the fundraising dinner next week. I lied and said Gareth and I had plans. His smile didn't change, but his eyes went cold, just for a second. He said he understood, but then he said something strange. He said, "A woman like you shouldn't be hidden away in these mountains." It wasn't a compliment. It felt like a judgment, like a threat. Gareth felt a cold fury building inside him. He remembered these times, but he had seen nothing. He had seen a wealthy benefactor taking an interest in his wife's passion project. He had been grateful. He had been a fool. As he read, he felt Rebecca's growing isolation, her fear. She was trapped, trying to protect her unborn child and her unsuspecting husband from a man who was slowly revealing himself to be a predator. Her courage was breathtaking. She was not a victim. She was a warrior, fighting a silent battle right under his roof. He finally reached the last entry, dated just 2 days before the accident. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. He knows, I don't know how, but he knows about the baby. He offered me a new life, a place for me and the child. Away from here, away from Gareth. He said Gareth was a broken soldier who couldn't give us what we deserved. When I refused, I saw the real man behind the mask. He is a monster. I have to get away. I have to protect my son. Gareth's blood ran cold. He flipped the page, but it was empty. The next page had been roughly torn out, leaving only a ragged edge. But at the very bottom of the previous page, scrawled in haste, was one final sentence. Where our melody began, where our future is kept safe. Gareth's eyes shot to the music box on the mantelpiece. The melody. Their melody. It wasn't just a sentimental phrase, it was a signpost, a breadcrumb trail left by a brilliant, desperate mind. It was a set of instructions, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he had to follow them. The house was silent save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second a hammer blow against the anvil of Gareth's thoughts. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. But inside, the storm was just beginning. Gareth sat on the edge of the sofa, the open journal in his lap, his eyes fixed on the final cryptic sentence. Where our melody began, where our future is kept safe. Kaiser, ever vigilant, had not left his side. The dog seemed to understand the weight of the moment, the shift in the atmosphere from sorrow to a tense, urgent questioning. He rested his chin on Gareth's knee, his amber eyes full of an almost human empathy. Our melody? Gareth whispered, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He looked at the music box on the mantelpiece, its dark wood gleaming in the dim light. Their melody. He had closed the lid, silenced the notes because the sound was too painful, a direct line to a past he couldn't bear to revisit. But now he understood. The pain was not the point. The memory was. Rebecca hadn't left him a riddle out of cruelty. She had left him a key forged from their shared love, trusting that he, and only he, could find the lock. He rose and walked back to the fireplace. His hand hovered over the box for a moment before he lifted the lid once more. The delicate, tinkling notes filled the room again. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to listen, to push past the wall of grief and truly hear the music. It was an old Appalachian folk song, one she had discovered in a dusty record store during their first year in the mountains. She had loved its simple, bittersweet tune about love and loss and the enduring strength of the hills. He let the melody wash over him, trying to grasp the memory that danced just at the edges of his mind. He saw her humming it while she painted, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw them dancing to it in the kitchen, laughing as they bumped into the countertops. It was the soundtrack to their life together. But what was it called? The name was a ghost, a whisper he couldn't quite catch. Frustration pricked at him. He was a Marine. He was trained to see patterns, to analyze intelligence, to find the objective. But this was different. This was a test of the heart, not the mind. He sank into the armchair, the music box still playing on the mantel, and dropped his head into his hands. Think, Gareth, think. He pictured the record sleeve. It was faded with a simple drawing of a mountain range. The band's name was unfamiliar. He tried to visualize the track list. And then it came to him, not in a flash of lightning, but as a slow, dawning warmth, like the first rays of sun over a mountain peak. The name of the song was Peculiar. It was the name of a place he had driven past 100 times. First Bank of Hendersonville. He said the words aloud, and the absurdity of it, the sheer, brilliant simplicity, hit him with the force of a physical blow. A low chuckle escaped his lips, the first sound of its kind in years. It was so perfectly Rebecca. She had taken a simple, sentimental memory and turned it into an unbreakable code. No one else on earth would have made the connection. No one else would have understood that their melody wasn't just a song. It was a signpost, a set of coordinates hidden in plain sight. Their future, the safe deposit box key in his pocket, was kept safe at the place where their melody began. The next morning, Gareth was a different man. The lethargy of grief had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard purpose. He moved with the crisp efficiency of a soldier preparing for a mission. He dressed, not in his usual worn-out clothes, but in a clean, pressed shirt. He shaved, the razor scraping away the stubble that had been a part of his grieving mask. When he looked in the mirror, the man looking back was still weary, his eyes still haunted, but there was a new light in them. A dangerous light, the light of a father. He and Kaiser were on the road before the morning mist had fully lifted from the valleys. The drive to Hendersonville took just under an hour. The familiar curves of the Blue Ridge Parkway seemed different today. The colors of the autumn leaves sharper, the air clearer. He wasn't just driving, he was advancing on a target. The First Bank of Hendersonville was an old, stately building of brick and granite, a pillar of small-town respectability. Gareth walked in, the bell above the door chiming softly. A polite, middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose looked up from her desk. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Her name tag read, Margaret. "I'm here to access a safe deposit box," Gareth said, his voice steady. He placed the small brass key on the polished counter. Margaret's professional smile was unwavering. She checked the number, typed something into her computer, and then retrieved a second key from a drawer. "Right this way, Mr. Mitchell." She led him through a carpeted office area to the vault. The door was a formidable circle of polished steel and gleaming brass. She unlocked it with a series of precise clicks and tums, then pulled the heavy door open, revealing the cool, quiet interior. Rows upon rows of metal boxes, all identical, lined the walls. It was a library of secrets. She led him to a small alcove, inserted both her key and his into a lock, and pulled out a long, slim metal box. "The viewing room is just to your left," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vault. "Take all the time you need." The viewing room was small and private, containing only a small table and a single chair. Gareth sat down, placing the box on the table in front of him. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This was it. The culmination of Rebecca's desperate, brilliant plan. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, were 3 items. The first was the torn page from the journal. He picked it up. Her handwriting filled the page, detailing her final, terrifying days. She wrote of Finch's ultimatum and her panicked decision to run, to disappear until the baby was born. She had planned to contact Gareth once she was safe, but she never got the chance. The second item was a folded, official-looking document. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a birth certificate issued by a small hospital 2 towns over. And at the top, in crisp, black letters, was the name, Michael Gareth Mitchell, his son. His son had his name. Seeing it in print, official and undeniable, shattered the last of his disbelief. A single hot tear traced a path down his cheek and fell onto the document, smudging the ink. The last item was a thick, sealed envelope. On the front, in her beautiful script, was one word: Gareth. He carefully broke the seal and pulled out several folded pages. It was a letter. Her voice, silent for 5 years, rose from the page. "My dearest Gareth," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means that my worst fears came true, and I was not strong enough or fast enough to protect our son. But I am not writing this to you in despair. I am writing it in faith, because I know you. I know the man I married. The doctors were wrong. You are not broken. You were never broken. You are the strongest, most whole person I have ever known. I kept this secret from you not because I didn't trust you, but because I love you too much. I couldn't bear to put another hope in your heart that might be taken away." And then, when I knew for certain, Alistair Finch had already sunk his claws into our lives. I saw the darkness in him. I knew that if I told you, you would have confronted him, and my love, he would have destroyed you. You are a warrior, but he is a different kind of monster, one that cannot be fought with fists or courage alone. So I made a choice. I chose to run. But I made a plan. I put my faith in 2 things: the undying loyalty of the best dog in the world and the unbreakable spirit of the man I love. I knew that one day Kaiser would lead you to the truth, and I know what you will do with that truth. The grief that has held you prisoner for so long will now become your fuel. The love you have for a son you've never met will become your armor. This is not a request, my love. It is my last order to you. Find him. Fight for him. Be the father I always knew you would be. Bring our son home." Gareth finished the letter, the paper shaking in his hand. The grief was still there, a hot ache in his chest, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a weight pulling him down, but a fire forging him into something new. The hollowed-out man who had walked into this bank was gone. In his place sat Sergeant Gareth Mitchell of the United States Marine Corps, and he had just been given his final, most important mission. Gareth drove back from Hendersonville, the metal box containing Rebecca's last words and his son's identity resting on the passenger seat. The world outside the truck's windows looked the same, but for Gareth, every color, every shadow had shifted. The familiar mountains no longer seemed like a peaceful sanctuary, but a silent witness to a battle he hadn't known was being fought. The grief was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but it had been joined by a cold, clear rage. It was the focused anger of a soldier who had identified his enemy. He knew he couldn't do this alone. Finch was powerful, protected by a fortress of wealth and public adoration. A frontal assault would be suicide. This was not a mission for a lone wolf. It required strategy, intelligence, and a skill set he no longer possessed in this civilian world. There was only one person he trusted enough, one person who operated in the same shadows Finch seemed to inhabit. Back at the cabin, Kaiser watched him, sensing the change. The dog's tail was no longer tucked in mournful sympathy, but held at a level, watchful angle. Gareth placed the box on the kitchen table and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through the sparse contact list, past the numbers for the local feed store and the veterinarian, until he found the name he was looking for: Gary Davis. He hadn't spoken to Gary in over 2 years. The calls had become less frequent after Rebecca's death, Gareth's monosyllabic answers a clear wall that even their deep-rooted friendship couldn't easily scale. He pressed the call button, his thumb hesitating for a fraction of a second. It was answered on the second ring. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." A voice, sharp and laced with a familiar East Coast sarcasm, crackled through the speaker. "Sergeant Mitchell, to what do I owe the honor? Don't tell me you finally figured out how to use that smartphone I sent you for Christmas in 2023. Gareth couldn't help a small, grim smile. Gary. The joking tone in Gary's voice vanished instantly, replaced by concern. "Gareth, you okay? You sound different." Gary Davis had been the polar opposite of Gareth in their unit. Where Gareth was tall, quiet, and physically imposing, Gary was of average height, with a wiry frame, constantly moving, his mind always working 3 steps ahead. He had been their comms and tech specialist, a genius who could make a field radio out of a roll of tinfoil and a prayer. After leaving the Corps, he had channeled that brilliance into a successful career as a private investigator in Raleigh, navigating the digital underworld as skillfully as he had once navigated enemy frequencies. "I need your help," Gareth said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. "You got it," Gary replied without hesitation. "Whatever it is, just say the word." And so, for the next hour, Gareth spoke more than he had in the last 5 years combined. He laid out the entire story, his voice a low, steady monotone as he recounted the events, from the boy at the grave to the letter in the bank vault. He read passages from Rebecca's journal, his voice cracking only once when he spoke his son's name aloud. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. When Gareth finished, the silence stretched on for a long moment. "Gary? You there?" "I'm here." Gary's voice was low, stripped of all its earlier humor. "I'm just processing. That son of a... Gareth, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry you've been carrying all this." There was a sound of furious typing in the background. "Alistair Finch, the Evergreen Circle. I'm already on it. Give me everything you have. Names, dates, locations. Don't leave out a single detail." For the rest of the day, Gareth was a man possessed. He scanned every document, every page of Rebecca's journal, and emailed them to Gary. He described Finch, Mike, the encounter at the cemetery, his memory for detail honed by years of reconnaissance training. With each piece of information he sent, he felt a small measure of control returning. He was no longer just a grieving husband. He was an operative in the field, feeding intelligence to his man behind the lines. Late that night, Gary called back. "Okay, I've got some preliminary intel," he said, his voice all business. "Your man, Finch, is a ghost. The public record on Alistair Finch begins about 10 years ago when he inherited a substantial fortune from a distant relative and started his philanthropic work. Before that, nothing. It's like he didn't exist. The name is almost certainly an alias. His digital footprint is scrubbed so clean, it squeaks. This isn't just a rich guy with good lawyers. This is professional-grade identity fabrication." Gareth's knuckles whitened as he gripped the phone. "Well, what about the organization?" "The Evergreen Circle is a fortress," Gary continued. "Legally, it's impeccable. The adoptions are all processed through the proper channels. The financials are audited by a top-tier firm. But there's a pattern. The children they place are often from convoluted or tragic backgrounds where the paper trail is messy. And the adoptive parents, we're talking about the 1% of the 1%. People with immense wealth and a desire for absolute privacy. It's the perfect setup for a high-end, bespoke adoption agency. Or a front for something much, much darker." A cold knot formed in Gareth's stomach. "A marketplace." "Exactly," Gary affirmed. "He's not just stealing children, he's curating them for a specific clientele. Your son, with his story, would be a prime commodity." After the call, Gareth couldn't sleep. He sat in Rebecca's study, the room he had avoided for so long, and slowly reread her journal, this time through a new lens. With Gary's words echoing in his ears, details he had skimmed over before now jumped out at him, glowing with a terrible, new significance. He remembered a conversation he'd overheard. Finch had been at their house, discussing a donation for the art program. Gareth had walked in as Finch was saying, "It's all about providing the right child for the right environment." At the time, it had sounded like philanthropic jargon. Now it sounded like a sales pitch. He remembered another time, a few weeks before Rebecca's death. He had come home early and found her in a heated discussion with Finch by the front door. He had only caught the end of it, her saying, "He is not an object for you to acquire, Alistair." Gareth had asked her what was wrong. She had paled and brushed it off, saying it was just a disagreement over the program's direction. He had believed her. He had been so lost in his own world, so convinced of his own brokenness, that he had failed to see her distress. He had failed to see the predator standing on his own doorstep. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest. Rebecca hadn't just been fighting Finch, she had been fighting his own apathy, his own blindness. His grief had not been a sanctuary. It had been a prison, not just for him, but for her. He had left her to face the monster alone. He closed his eyes, the image of her forced smile, the fear she had hidden so well behind her eyes, burning into his memory. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, silent mountains. The guilt was still there, a sharp, cutting blade. But Rebecca's letter had been right. It was also fuel. It merged with the image of a small boy crying at a tombstone with the sight of his own name next to his son's on a birth certificate. It was no longer just about getting his son back. It was about avenging the woman who had died protecting him. It was about finishing the fight she had started. He had been a ghost for 5 years, but now he was a hunter. The silence that followed Gary's assessment of the Evergreen Circle was heavy and absolute. It was the kind of quiet Gareth knew well, the charged stillness before an assault, thick with unspoken risks and calculations. "So," Gareth finally said, his voice a low rumble, "he's built a fortress." "A digital and legal one, yeah," Gary confirmed from the other end of the line. His voice was grim. "We can chip away at his online persona, maybe find a crack in his financial armor, but it'll take months, maybe years. And by then, who knows where your son will be? Finch is a professional, G. He doesn't make mistakes that can be found from a keyboard. If there's proof, real undeniable proof of what he's doing, it's not going to be on a public server. It's going to be on paper, on a hard drive, locked away inside that headquarters of his." Gareth looked around his small, quiet cabin. For 5 years, these walls had been his world, a sanctuary from a past he couldn't face. Now they felt like a cage. "The headquarters, where is it?" "A private estate about 30 miles east of Asheville," Gary said, a series of clicks from his keyboard punctuating his words. "Secluded, gated. I'm sending you the satellite imagery and whatever blueprints are publicly filed. It's not much, but it's a start." A moment later, Gareth's laptop pinged. He opened the file. A high-resolution satellite photo filled the screen, showing a large, modern building nestled in a clearing, surrounded by acres of dense forest. It was isolated, a modern-day castle. "We need to get inside, Gary." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of intent. "I know," Gary said softly. "But listen to me. This isn't a mud brick compound in the desert. The schematics show a state-of-the-art security system. Pressure plates on the perimeter fence, infrared cameras with overlapping fields of view, biometric scanners on the main doors, and a private security team on patrol. This is a hard target, man. A very hard target." "Every fortress has a weak point," Gareth said, his eyes already tracing the lines of the building, his mind shifting, the gears grinding back into motion after years of rust and disuse. The fog of grief began to recede, burned away by the clear, cold fire of a mission objective. After the call, Gareth moved with a purpose he hadn't felt since he'd taken off his uniform. He went into his workshop, a place that had been silent for years, and cleared the large wooden workbench. He printed the satellite photos and the blueprints, pinning them to the wall. He found old topographical maps of the area and spread them out, marking elevation lines and potential approach routes. The cabin was no longer a tomb of memories. It had become a command center. For the next week, Gareth was a man reborn. The ghost who haunted the mountain trails was gone. In his place was Sergeant Mitchell. He rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime reasserting itself. He and Kaiser would run for miles, the dog pacing him effortlessly, the crisp mountain air filling Gareth's lungs, clearing his head. The physical exertion was a release, a way to channel the raging storm of guilt and anger into something productive. During the days, he conducted his own reconnaissance. He drove the winding roads around the Evergreen estate, never stopping in the same place twice. He sat for hours in his truck, parked on a high ridge overlooking the property, a pair of powerful binoculars to his eyes. He wasn't just looking, he was observing. He timed the guard patrols. He noted the arrival of delivery trucks. He mapped the camera locations, seeing not just where they were, but where they weren't. At night, he would talk to Gary, feeding him the raw data. Gary, in turn, worked his own magic. He hacked into the county's public works database, finding information on the power and communication lines running to the estate. He identified the brand of security system Finch used, a high-end commercial model, and began searching for its vulnerabilities. Slowly, a plan began to take shape, born from Gareth's boots-on-the-ground intelligence and Gary's digital wizardry. "There's a blind spot," Gareth said during a call one evening, his finger tracing a line on the satellite photo. "On the north side, where the forest comes closest to the building, there's a 30-foot stretch between Camera 7 and Camera 8 that isn't fully covered. It's masked by a cluster of old-growth oak trees." "I see it," Gary said, "but the perimeter fence has a seismic sensor. Touch it, and the whole place lights up like a Christmas tree." "The patrol passes that section at 17 minutes past the hour every hour," Gareth continued, his voice calm, measured. "He's out of sight for maybe 2 minutes. Not enough time to get over the fence and across the open ground to the building." "I can help with that," Gary said. "The system they're using has a known back-end maintenance portal. It's heavily encrypted, but nothing is unhackable. I can get in. I can create a loop on the camera feeds and disable that section of the fence sensor. But I can only hold it for a short time before the system reboots. Max, 90 seconds. 90 seconds! A lifetime in a firefight. An eternity in a quiet cabin. But here, it was nothing. Not enough to account for the human element. The guard. "I need more time," Gareth stated. "I need the guard to be pulled away from that section. I need a distraction." His eyes fell on Kaiser, who was lying at his feet, watching him with an unnerving intelligence. The dog had been his shadow throughout this process, a silent, constant presence. And in that moment, Gareth saw not just a companion, but a partner. The next day, the training began. In a clearing deep in the woods behind his cabin, Gareth worked with Kaiser. He didn't need the dog to be an attack animal. He needed him to be a ghost. He used a series of low hand signals and quiet verbal cues. The objective was simple. On command, Kaiser was to create a sharp, sudden noise, a flurry of barks, a frantic scrabbling sound in the underbrush at a specific location. Then, just as suddenly, he was to go completely silent and retreat back to a designated rally point. It was a test of discipline and trust. Kaiser, bred for intelligence and loyalty, learned quickly. The bond between them, already strong, deepened into something more profound. It was the unspoken communication of a military team, a perfect synergy of instinct and training. Man and dog working as one unit with one purpose. A week later, the plan was complete. Every detail was mapped out, every contingency considered. Gareth stood before the workbench, which was now covered in notes, diagrams, and timings. He looked at the layout of the enemy compound. He felt the familiar thrum of adrenaline, the cold knot of fear in his gut. But it wasn't the paralyzing fear of a man lost in the past. It was the sharp, focused fear of a soldier before a mission. He looked down at Kaiser, who sat patiently, his gaze fixed on Gareth's face, waiting for his orders. Gareth reached down and rested a hand on the dog's head, scratching behind his ears. "It's time, boy," he whispered. "It's time to go bring him home." The moon was a sliver of bone, hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The forest floor was a tapestry of shadow and sound, the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hunting owl. To any observer, the woods would have seemed empty, but within the deepest darkness, two figures moved with a silence that was a part of the night itself. Gareth moved with the fluid economy of a predator, his feet finding purchase on the soft earth without snapping a twig. He was dressed in black from head to toe, his face streaked with camo paint. A small pack was cinched tight to his back, carrying the bare essentials. At his side, Kaiser padded along, a gray shadow against the deeper black of the forest, his body low to the ground, every muscle coiled with controlled energy. They stopped at the edge of the tree line, 100 yards from the perimeter fence of the Evergreen Circle. The main building was a monolith of dark glass and steel, its cold, geometric lines an intrusion on the organic beauty of the mountains. A few lights glowed from within, sterile and unwelcoming. Gareth pulled a small military-grade satellite phone from his pocket. He pressed a single button. "Ghost in position," he whispered, the words barely audible. "How we lookin', Watchman?" Gary's voice came back, a disembodied crackle in his earpiece. "Watchman is online. I've got eyes on their system. You were right, G. Their security is top-notch, but they got complacent. The maintenance portal is my front door. I'm ready when you are. The patrol is making his rounds. He'll be at your designated distraction point in 4 minutes." "Understood," Gareth breathed. He looked down at Kaiser. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on his, waiting. There was no fear in them, only absolute trust. Gareth's heart swelled with a fierce pride. He knelt, resting his forehead against Kaiser's for a brief second. "You know what to do, boy. Make some noise. Then get back to the rally point. Be safe." Kaiser gave a low, almost inaudible whine of understanding and licked Gareth's hand once before melting back into the shadows, circling wide to approach the fence from the opposite side. Gareth watched the seconds tick by on his watch, his breathing slow and even, his heart a steady drum. He tracked the progress of the lone guard, a man named Henderson according to Gary's intel, a heavyset man in his late 50s just doing a job. He saw the beam of Henderson's flashlight cutting a lazy arc through the darkness on the far side of the property. 3 minutes. 2. 1. "Now, Gary," Gareth whispered. "Engaging," Gary's voice replied. "Cameras are looping. Fence sensors on the north side are down. You have 90 seconds. Go." At that exact moment, a sudden explosive cacophony erupted from the south perimeter. A furious series of barks, followed by a frantic scrambling sound in the underbrush, echoed through the quiet night. On the other side of the compound, Henderson jumped, his flashlight beam snapping toward the sound. "What in the world?" he muttered into his radio. "Control, Henderson here. Got something making a racket on the south fence. Sounds like a big animal, maybe a bear. I'm going to check it out." The guard turned and began a lumbering jog toward the disturbance. It was the perfect diversion. He was moving away from the blind spot, away from Gareth. Gareth didn't wait. He vaulted from the tree line, covering the 30 feet of open ground in a matter of seconds. He reached the 10-foot chain-link fence, his gloved hands finding purchase. He moved with a strength and agility he hadn't felt in years, pulling himself up and over the top, landing in a silent crouch on the other side. 60 seconds left. He ran, his boots making no sound on the manicured lawn. He reached the side of the building, pressing himself flat against the cold, smooth wall. Using a small, specialized tool, he worked on the lock of a maintenance door Gary had identified as a weak point. The tumblers clicked. The door opened. He slipped inside. 30 seconds left. He was in a small utility corridor. He moved quickly, following the memorized blueprint in his mind. The building was silent, the air still and climate-controlled. Finch's office was on the second floor, corner suite. He took the stairs, 2 at a time. Finch's office was a monument to his ego. It was vast and minimalist, with a single, massive desk of polished obsidian and a wall of glass overlooking the dark mountains. It was less an office and more a throne room. Gareth went to work immediately. He ignored the desk and went straight for the locked filing cabinets. He bypassed the simple lock with a tension wrench and pick set. Inside, he found what he was looking for. Neatly labeled folders for every child who had passed through the Evergreen Circle. He found the one labeled Michael Allen. The surname was a fiction Finch had created. Gareth's hands were steady as he pulled out his phone and began photographing every single document, the falsified surrender papers, the fraudulent medical history, the carefully constructed new identity. He worked his way through the other files, documenting evidence of a dozen other children, their pasts erased, their futures sold. And then he found it. Tucked away in the back of the bottom drawer, separate from the others, was a single, slim file. There was no name on the tab. His breath caught in his throat. He opened it. The contents punched the air from his lungs. It was a file on Rebecca. It was filled with photographs of her, many of which he had never seen. Candid shots, her laughing at the local farmer's market, her reading on their porch, her walking Kaiser down a trail. They were taken from a distance, the work of a stalker. Tucked between the photos were handwritten notes, Finch's elegant script detailing her habits, her schedule, her likes and dislikes. It was a blueprint of obsession, a chilling testament to the sick, possessive desire Finch had harbored for her. A white-hot rage, pure and absolute, surged through Gareth. He wanted to scream. He wanted to destroy this sterile, perfect office, to tear it apart with his bare hands. His vision narrowed, and for a terrifying second, the disciplined soldier vanished, replaced by a primal need for vengeance. Then he felt it, the phantom weight of his body armor, the muscle memory of his rifle in his hands, the ghosts of his fallen comrades standing at his shoulder. The training kicked in, a dam of ice against the inferno of his rage. Control. Mission first. He took a steadying breath, the air burning his lungs, and forced his shaking hands to photograph every single page. This was not the time for rage. This was the time for evidence. "Gareth, you need to move," Gary's urgent voice crackled in his ear. "The system is initiating a reboot sequence. You've got 60 seconds before the alarms come back online. Go now." Gareth shoved the file back, closed the cabinet, and moved. He didn't run. He flowed, a shadow retracing his steps back down the stairs, through the corridor, and out the maintenance door. He was halfway across the lawn when the first of the exterior lights flickered back on. He scaled the fence, dropping to the soft earth on the other side just as the entire compound was bathed in the harsh glare of security floodlights. He sprinted into the safety of the woods, his heart hammering against his ribs. He made his way to the prearranged rally point, a small rocky outcrop a quarter-mile away. As he approached, a gray shape detached itself from the shadows. Kaiser was there, waiting for him, safe and sound. Gareth dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in his fur. Kaiser whined and licked his face, sensing the storm of emotions his master was trying to contain. They had done it. They were out. And in his pocket, on a small memory card, was the key to Alistair Finch's destruction. The first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose as Gareth guided his truck into the deserted parking lot of a 24-hour diner just outside Raleigh. He had driven through the night, a silent, focused journey with Kaiser asleep on the passenger seat, the precious memory card a burning weight in his pocket. He saw Gary's nondescript sedan parked in the far corner and pulled in alongside it. Gary Davis got out of his car, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. He looked as if he hadn't slept in a week, his usual sharp attire rumpled, but his eyes were bright and alert. "You look like hell, G," Gary said, his voice a low rasp. "You're no beauty queen yourself," Gareth countered, a hint of their old banter returning. He reached into his pocket and held out the small black memory card. It seemed impossibly small to hold the key to so much destruction. "Here it is, everything." Gary took it with an almost reverent care. "I've already made the call, sent them a teaser, just enough to get their attention without revealing our hand. We have a meeting in 2 hours. Special agent in charge, Violent Crimes Against Children Division. They're taking it seriously." He glanced into the truck at the sleeping dog. "And the operative?" "Performed his duties flawlessly," Gareth said, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. "He's earned a stake." 2 hours later, they were in a different world. The warm, worn-out diner was replaced by the cold, impersonal environment of the Raleigh FBI field office. The air smelled of clean carpets and bureaucracy. They were led into a windowless conference room, the only decoration a framed American flag on the wall. A woman entered the room a few minutes later. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back in a severe professional bun. Her gray suit was immaculate. She moved with an air of brisk, no-nonsense authority. "Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice crisp and clear. I'm Special Agent Miller. Thank you for coming in. Mr. Davis has provided us with a compelling, if anonymous, tip regarding Alistair Finch. Now, I'd like to hear the full story from you." For the second time in as many weeks, Gareth laid out the entire narrative. But this time, it wasn't a desperate plea to a friend. It was a formal deposition. He spoke with the precision of a soldier giving an after-action report, detailing every step, from the encounter at the cemetery to the contents of the files in Finch's office. Gary sat beside him, occasionally interjecting to provide technical context for the evidence they had gathered. Agent Miller listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Gareth finished, she steepled her fingers and stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Mitchell, you do understand that what you've described involves breaking and entering, theft of private documents, and a number of other felonies?" "I understand that I did what was necessary to find my son and to stop a monster," Gareth replied, his voice level, his gaze unwavering. "And you have the evidence you claim to have acquired on this memory card?" Gary slid the card across the polished table. "It's all there, Agent. Financials, doctored adoption papers, the personal files. Everything." Miller took the card and inserted it into a secure laptop. For the next half hour, the only sound in the room was the soft clicking of the keyboard as she reviewed the files. Gareth watched her face. The mask of professional detachment slowly crumbled, replaced by a look of dawning horror, which in turn hardened into a cold, determined anger. She stopped at the file on Rebecca, her eyes narrowing as she took in the stalker-like photos and obsessive notes. She finally closed the laptop. "Mr. Davis, our technical team will need your full cooperation to verify the methods used to acquire this data. Mr. Mitchell, you will need to remain here and provide a full formal statement. Do not leave the city." Her tone was no longer questioning. It was commanding. "We are acting on this immediately." The storm broke the next afternoon. Gareth was in a sterile hotel room that Gary had booked for him, watching the national news. A reporter stood in front of the grand, gated entrance of the Evergreen Circle, which was now swarming with federal agents. The headline blared across the bottom of the screen: "Philanthropist Alistair Finch arrested in child trafficking probe." The report showed Finch, no longer the picture of suave sophistication, being led away in handcuffs. His face was a mask of stunned disbelief and fury. The story was a bombshell, a shocking betrayal by a man the public had seen as a saint. Gareth watched it all, feeling not a sense of triumph, but a profound, weary emptiness. This was a victory, but the war for his son was far from over. The days that followed were a blur of debriefings and interrogations. He was a witness, a victim, and a person of interest all at once. But then the nature of the questions shifted. The focus turned from Finch to him. He was no longer in a conference room with FBI agents, but in a small, quiet office with a man and a woman from social services. The man, a psychologist named Dr. Evans, was kind, with gentle eyes, but his questions were like surgical probes, carefully searching for weaknesses. "Sergeant Mitchell," he began, "your service record is exemplary, but it also notes 2 tours in active combat zones. Can you tell me about your experiences?" Gareth's hands clenched under the table. He was back in the desert, the sun a merciless hammer, the air thick with dust and the smell of cordite. "I did my duty." "Of course, Dr. Evans said softly. "But did you ever seek counseling upon your return for post-traumatic stress?" "The military provides resources," Gareth answered evasively. "But did you use them?" The woman, a social worker named Ms. Albright, pressed. Her tone was sharper, more direct. "We have your medical records, Mr. Mitchell. They show a diagnosis of PTSD, for which you declined treatment." "I had my own way of dealing with it," Gareth said, his voice tight. "By isolating yourself in a cabin for 5 years?" Ms. Albright countered. "By cutting off contact with your friends and family?" "Mr. Mitchell, we are trying to determine your fitness to be a parent to a child who has already experienced significant trauma, a child who will need stability, patience, and emotional availability. Your actions over the past 5 years do not paint a picture of a man who is emotionally available." Every question was a blow. They picked apart his grief, his isolation, his silence. They brought up the ghosts of the war, the men he had lost, the things he had seen. They wanted to know if the man who could plan and execute a military-style raid on a secure compound was the same man who could comfort a child's nightmare. The rage that he had suppressed in Finch's office began to simmer. He wanted to lash out, to tell them they had no idea what they were talking about. But he saw the trap. An outburst would only prove their point. He took a breath, forcing the discipline to take hold. He thought of Rebecca's letter. "The grief that has held you prisoner will now become your fuel." "You're right," he said, his voice quiet but firm, looking directly at Ms. Albright. "For 5 years, I was a ghost. I was lost. The war took something from me, and then losing my wife. It took the rest. I built walls around myself because I didn't think there was anything left inside to protect. I was wrong." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Everything you've said about me is true. But what you don't see is the man I am today. Finding out I have a son, it didn't just give me a mission. It gave me a reason to tear down those walls. Yes, I have scars, but those scars don't make me weak. They are a part of who I am. They taught me about loss, and they taught me about the absolute, unbreakable duty to protect those you love. I am not the man I was 6 weeks ago. I am a father, and I will go through any fire, I will face any demon, inside or out, to be the father my son needs me to be." He finished, his chest heaving, the words hanging in the silent room. Dr. Evans and Ms. Albright looked at him, their expressions unreadable. The battle against Finch had been won with stealth and evidence. This battle, the one for his own soul, had been fought with nothing but the raw, painful, and undeniable truth. The courtroom was an arena of polished wood and hushed tension. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the low murmur of anticipation. For Gareth, it felt more intimidating than any battlefield he had ever known. Here, the weapons were not rifles and explosives, but words, twisted and aimed with surgical precision. He sat at the prosecution's table, his back ramrod straight, in an unfamiliar suit Gary had insisted he buy. He felt like a caged animal, exposed under the cold fluorescent lights. Across the room, at the defense table, sat Alistair Finch. He was a portrait of calm, untouchable arrogance, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. He occasionally conferred with his lead attorney, a man named Marcus Thorne, whose reputation was as sharp and expensive as his attire. Thorne was a shark, known for dismantling witnesses with a chillingly polite and methodical cruelty. The trial had been going on for 3 days. The prosecution, led by a determined assistant U.S. attorney, had methodically laid out the case, presenting the evidence from the memory card. The courtroom had listened in stunned silence as the details of the Evergreen Circle's operations were revealed, a sophisticated pipeline for trafficking children to the highest bidder. But now it was Gareth's turn to take the stand. As he walked to the witness box, he could feel Finch's cold, analytical gaze on him. It wasn't the look of a worried man. It was the look of a collector studying an insect just before pinning it to a board. After the prosecutor's gentle, fact-based questioning, Marcus Thorne rose and approached the stand. He moved with a languid confidence, a faint, predatory smile playing on his lips. "Sergeant Mitchell," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "An impressive title, one that commands respect. You served your country with distinction, did you not?" "I served," Gareth answered, his voice steady. "2 tours in some of the most hostile environments on the planet. You saw things, I imagine, things that the average person could not comprehend." "Yes. And these experiences, they leave a mark, don't they?" Thorne's voice was full of feigned sympathy. "The military's own doctors diagnosed you with post-traumatic stress disorder. A severe case, their notes say, yet you declined treatment." "I had my own way of dealing with it," Gareth repeated the words he had spoken to the social workers. Thorne's smile widened. Ah, yes, your way. By moving to a remote cabin in the mountains, by cutting off nearly all human contact for 5 years. Would you call that dealing with it, Sergeant, or would you call that hiding? Objection, the prosecutor interjected. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge, a stern white-haired woman named Judge Eva Holloway, said without looking up from her notes. Mr. Thorne, get to the point. Thorne gave a slight bow. My point, Your Honor, is the witness's state of mind. Sergeant, is it true that during this period of isolation you suffered from flashbacks? That you had trouble distinguishing the past from the present? Gareth's jaw tightened. He thought of the nightmares, the scent of sand and smoke that would ambush him in the quiet of the forest. At times. And is it also true that you planned and executed a covert illegal infiltration of my client's private property? An operation requiring a level of tactical skill one might associate with a military raid? I did what I had to do. Of course you did, Thorne said, turning to the jury. Here is a man, trained for violence, suffering from untreated trauma, living in isolation for 5 years. And he expects this court to believe his wild, elaborate story, a story built on evidence he obtained illegally, a story about a philanthropic leader and a child he suddenly claims is his own. Tell me, Sergeant, is it possible that this entire narrative is nothing more than a product of a fractured mind desperately seeking a new mission, a new enemy to fight? The words hung in the air, venomous and plausible. Gareth felt a surge of hot rage. He looked at the jury, at their uncertain, pitying faces. He was losing. Thorne had painted him as a broken, unstable vigilante. But then the prosecution began its redirect. The assistant U.S. attorney, a young, sharp woman named Maria Sanchez, approached him. Sergeant Mitchell, let's talk about that evidence, she said calmly. She had the court clerk display the photos of Rebecca's file on the large screens. The candid, stalker-like images filled the courtroom. This was in Mr. Finch's private office. Can you explain any legitimate reason a philanthropist would have a secret file like this on your late wife? Gareth looked at the photos, the pain a fresh wound. No, there is no legitimate reason. Then Sanchez produced Rebecca's letter. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to read into the record a letter written by Rebecca Mitchell, recovered from her safe deposit box. Thorne was on his feet. Objection! Hearsay! It speaks to the victim's state of mind and provides context for her actions, Your Honor, Sanchez countered. It is the core of this entire case. I'll allow it, Judge Holloway ruled. Sanchez read the letter. Rebecca's voice, full of love, fear, and an unshakable faith in her husband, filled the silent courtroom. She spoke of Finch's darkness, of her plan, of her certainty that Gareth's love would be his guide. When she finished, there were audible sniffs from the jury box. The image of the broken soldier was being replaced by the image of a grieving husband entrusted with a final, sacred duty. The next day, the prosecution called Gary Davis to the stand. Calm and professional, Gary detailed the technical evidence, explaining how Finch's digital fortress was a facade designed to hide the truth. Thorne's aggressive cross-examination barely laid a glove on him. But the most powerful testimony came from the final witness. An older man in a crisp, decorated uniform walked to the stand. Please state your name for the record, Sanchez said. Sergeant Major Thomas Riley, United States Marine Corps, retired. Riley was a legend, a man who had served for 30 years. He had been Gareth's commanding officer during his first tour. Sergeant Major, Sanchez began, you served with the defendant, Gareth Mitchell. Can you tell the court about him? Riley looked directly at Gareth, then turned to the jury. His voice was a gravelly baritone that commanded attention. I can tell you that Gareth Mitchell was one of the finest Marines I ever had the privilege of leading. He was quiet, but he had a core of steel. In a firefight, he was the man you wanted watching your back. He was calm under pressure. He never lost his head, and he never, ever left a man behind. Thorne tried to discredit him on cross-examination. "A fine soldier, I'm sure, but we're not in a firefight now, are we, Sergeant Major?" Riley leaned forward, his eyes boring into Thorne. "Sir, you are mistaken. A man fighting for his child, fighting for the memory of his wife, is in the biggest firefight of his life, and I am telling this court that there is no one better equipped for that fight than Gareth Mitchell." The closing arguments were a formality. The jury was out for less than 3 hours. When they filed back in, the foreman, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, refused to look at Finch. Judge Holloway read the verdict. "On the charge of human trafficking, we, the jury, find the defendant, Alistair Finch, guilty." A gasp went through the courtroom. Finch's face, for the first time, registered shock, his mask of civility cracking to reveal the seething rage beneath. 2 weeks later, Gareth was back in Judge Holloway's courtroom for the custody hearing. It was a much quieter affair. Finch was gone, his legal battles just beginning. Dr. Evans and Ms. Albright were there, their final report having been submitted. Judge Holloway looked down at Gareth from the bench. Her expression was no longer stern, but held a trace of compassion. "Mr. Mitchell, this court has reviewed all the evidence in the criminal trial as well as the comprehensive report from social services. It is clear that you have endured unimaginable loss. It is also clear that your path to recovering your son involved actions this court cannot condone." Gareth's heart sank. "However," the judge continued, her voice softening, "this court also recognizes the extraordinary circumstances you faced. We have read your late wife's letter. It is rare to see such faith and love. She put her trust in you, and you have honored that trust. You faced the demons of your past, not by hiding from them, but by using your experiences to fuel your fight for your son's future." She looked down at the paperwork in front of her. "Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that the parental rights of the biological father, Gareth Mitchell, are fully restored. Full and sole legal custody of the child, Michael Gareth Mitchell, is hereby granted to you." She lifted her gavel. The sound it made as it struck the block was not loud, but it echoed in the silent room like a thunderclap. It was the sound of a war ending. It was the sound of a future beginning. It was the sound of justice. The victory in the courtroom had been loud, a clash of wills that ended with the satisfying crack of a gavel. The reunion, however, was terrifyingly quiet. It took place a week after the custody hearing, in a sterile pastel-colored room at a county child services facility. The room was designed to be calming, with soft chairs and children's drawings taped to the walls, but to Gareth it felt like a holding cell. He sat on a small sofa, his large frame making the furniture seem miniature. His hands, which had remained steady while dismantling a lock in the dead of night, were now sweating, his heart hammering a frantic, unsteady rhythm against his ribs. Ms. Albright, the social worker, entered first. "He's ready, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice softer than it had been in their previous encounters. "Remember what we discussed. Be patient. This is a new world for him. For both of you?" Gareth could only nod, his throat too tight for words. Then the door opened again, and a small boy was led into the room. It was Mike. He was no longer the waif-like figure Gareth had seen at the cemetery. He was clean, his dark hair neatly combed, and he was wearing new clothes. But he was smaller than Gareth remembered, and his eyes, the same deep brown as Rebecca's, were wide with a guarded, fearful apprehension. He held on to the hand of his temporary foster mother, a kind-looking older woman, as if it were a lifeline. He didn't look at Gareth. He stared at a spot on the carpet, his small shoulders hunched, a soldier bracing for impact. "Mike," Gareth said, his voice coming out as a rough whisper. It was the first time he had spoken his son's name directly to him. The boy flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his frame. The foster mother gently nudged him forward. "This is your father, Michael. He's come to take you home." Gareth slowly, carefully, knelt down to be on the boy's level, mindful not to make any sudden moves. "Hello, Mike," he tried again, forcing a smile that felt brittle and unnatural. I'm Gareth." Mike remained silent, his gaze still fixed on the floor. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Gareth's mind, so adept at tactical planning, was a complete blank. He had no strategy for this. There were no orders, no objectives, just a vast uncharted territory of a child's fear. He had brought a gift, a small, beautifully carved wooden truck he had painstakingly made in his workshop. He held it out. "I made this for you." Mike glanced at the truck, then quickly looked away, retreating further into his shell. The rejection was a physical blow, sharper than any bullet. It was in that moment of despair that a soft scratch came at the door. Miss Albright opened it, and a familiar gray head poked through. Gary, who had been waiting outside, gave Kaiser a quiet command. The dog entered the room, not with his usual boisterous energy, but with a slow, deliberate calmness. Kaiser's intelligent amber eyes scanned the room, passed over Gareth, and settled on the small, tense figure of the boy. He seemed to understand instantly. He didn't rush forward. Instead, he lay down on the floor, about 10 feet away from Mike, placed his head on his paws, and let out a soft, low sigh, as if to say, "I'm here. No threat." For the first time, Mike's expression changed. His gaze lifted from the floor and fixed on the dog. He watched him, his head tilted. He took a hesitant step away from his foster mother, then another. He slowly approached the dog, his movements cautious. He stopped a few feet away, just watching. Kaiser didn't move, save for a slow, gentle thump-thump-thump of his tail against the carpet. Mike knelt down, mirroring Gareth's earlier posture. He reached out a small, trembling hand and rested it on Kaiser's broad head. The dog closed his eyes and leaned into the touch. A small, choked sob escaped Mike's lips, the first sound he had made. He buried his face in Kaiser's thick fur, his small body shaking. Kaiser just lay there, a steadfast, breathing anchor in the boy's stormy sea of confusion and fear. Gareth watched, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. He felt a pang of something that wasn't jealousy, but a profound, humbling understanding. The trust he so desperately wanted couldn't be demanded or forced. It had to be earned. And the first bridge had just been built, not by a man, but by the unwavering, unconditional love of a dog. The first few weeks back at the cabin were a delicate dance of distance. The house, once achingly empty, was now filled with the quiet presence of a child who was more like a ghost. Mike spoke only when necessary, in soft, one-word answers. He ate what was put in front of him without complaint and retreated to the room that had once been Rebecca's study, which Gareth had filled with books and art supplies. Gareth learned to communicate not with words, but with actions. He learned that Mike liked his pancakes cut into star shapes. He learned that the boy was afraid of the dark, so he installed a small nightlight shaped like the moon in his room. He learned that Mike loved the smell of wood smoke and would often just sit and watch him as he split logs for the fireplace. Kaiser was the constant intermediary. He was the one who would nudge Mike with a ball when he looked sad. He was the one who would lie at the foot of Mike's bed until he fell asleep. The first time Gareth heard his son laugh, it was a sound as bright and unexpected as a wildflower in a barren field. He had looked out the kitchen window to see Mike in the yard, throwing a stick for Kaiser, a wide, uninhibited grin on his face. Gareth hadn't interrupted. He had just watched, committing the precious sound to memory. The healing was a two-way street. One night, Gareth was awoken by a scream. He rushed into Mike's room to find him thrashing in the grip of a nightmare, his face pale with terror. Gareth's own demons stirred, the familiar ghosts of the desert reaching for him. But the sight of his son's fear was stronger. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the boy into his arms. "It's okay," he whispered, the words feeling foreign but right. "You're safe. I've got you." He held him until the trembling stopped, and in comforting his son, he felt a part of his own broken past begin to knit itself back together. The seasons turned. The stark white of winter gave way to the tender green of spring. The mountains came alive with color and birdsong. One bright, clear morning in early May, Gareth packed a small bunch of white daisies from the garden. "Come on, Mike," he said gently. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." They drove to the small cemetery on Oak Ridge. The air was warm, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. They walked hand in hand, a new and still fragile habit, to Rebecca's grave. The stone was clean, the grass around it neat. Gareth knelt and placed the daisies at the base of the headstone. "This is your mom, Mike," Gareth said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name was Rebecca. She was an artist. She would have loved you so much. She was the one who brought Kaiser home for me. She knew I needed him." Mike looked at the name carved into the granite. He looked at the flowers. He looked at Kaiser, who sat beside him, panting softly. He didn't cry this time. He just looked, his young face serious, thoughtful. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, a silent vigil under the warm spring sun. The past was with them, not as a haunting ghost, but as a gentle presence, a foundation on which they could build. As they turned to leave, Gareth felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down. Mike was looking up at him, his brown eyes, so much like hers, clear and trusting. He offered a small, shy smile. Gareth's fingers closed around his son's. The connection was real, solid, and full of a quiet, unspoken promise. He looked up at the mountains, at the endless blue sky. The war was over. The mission was complete. The long, silent winter of his soul had finally ended, and in its place, a new melody, quiet and hopeful, had begun. The story of Gareth, Mike, and Kaiser reminds us that sometimes the deepest wounds are healed not by time, but by a love that is patient enough to wait and a loyalty that is brave enough to lead the way home. If their journey to find family again has touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your likes and comments become a cherished part of our community's story, and by subscribing, you ensure these tales of courage and companionship continue. A new story is already waiting for you, right here on the screen.